Hi, my name is Jim Harrold. I'm a PhD from the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and this is a video presentation of my dissertation defense, which occurred on April 6, 2016. And this video will give you an understanding of what my dissertation's about in abbreviated form, really. And so my dissertation is titled Understanding Policy Change and Policy Reform of United States Military Retirement Policy from 1965 to 1999. So it's a historical study of policy change over that period. So what is this animal, the military retirement policy? Well, this slide has three takeaways for you. The first is that this is a very persistent policy. In 1861, the United States Congress invented military retirement, really to differentiate it from the previous military pensions, which went on to become what we know as veterans benefits. So it's a very persistent policy. And then after World War II, the clientele population, namely military retirees, grew. And then this led to this second takeaway, which is the cost and organizational effectiveness became matters of some concern in Congress. And also this led to the development of really a group of fierce advocates of military retirement as well as a group of fierce opponents of military retirement. And then the third takeaway is that this idea that the military retirement system should be reformed as advocated by its opponents led to a plethora of studies. Really about 23 studies from 1948 to the present time have been conducted, most of which have recommended reform. And so what is reform? Let me talk about that for just a second. I define reform basically in this dissertation almost as if one defines art. There really is no good definition of policy reform. Reform itself is in the eye of the reformer. In this case, the reformers wanted to change the defined benefit program, which would have the effect of reducing the benefit for beneficiaries, and that would have the effect of lowering the long-term cost. And so this happened once, exactly, in 1986, but then Congress repealed its own reform in 1999, and I wanted to know why, in spite of a lot of talk about reform, the only time reform happened was 1986, and then Congress thought that was a mistake and reformed it only 13 years later, which is a pretty short period in congressional time. And so to do this, I used two theoretical frameworks, punctuated equilibrium and the advocacy coalition framework. And I did that because each of these traditions specifies that policy change should be studied over a period of time, not just cross-sectionally. And so I came up with three time periods, and which I'll get to later how those are defined. But I want to get particular insights from each of these theoretical frameworks, and I list them here. From PET, I want to understand punctuations, attention shifts, and policy image framing. And from ACF, I really want to understand if there are coalitions and how stable these coalitions are. And so I drew up two research questions, really one from each theoretical tradition. And again, from PET, I am looking to see if I can detect changes in the policy image frames and disproportionate attention leading up to 1986 and 1999. And from ACF, I want to see if I can understand whether or not policy actors coalesce around their policy beliefs leading to the construction of coalitions. And so when I looked at the literature for military retirement, which really come from three sources, academic literature in the mainline journals, specialty literature, which is really produced by a lot of think tanks. In particular, there are organizations like RAND in Santa Monica, California, which talk a lot about military retirement. And then this official literature, and the official literature really that I used was mostly the studies themselves. When I looked at the literature, I found that there were really three themes for all the literature. There was a discussion of the purposes of military retirement, what the DoD says military retirement purports to do for its personnel system. There was a series of criticisms of military retirement, and then there were elements of reform where a lot of the studies or a lot of the people who write about military retirement come up with about 8 different measures of reform and recommendations that they put forth if they were going to reform military retirement. So keep this chart in mind. This will come up later in my methodology. Now, my methodology really is built like a court case. I'm looking for a preponderance of evidence. And so it's a mixed methodology that it's not statistical in nature. It's really very qualitative in nature, but it is looking for preponderance of evidence to make my conclusions. And I talked earlier about these 3 historical periods. Well, really 1965 was when Congress first became very concerned about the growth in the cost of military personnel in general, retirees and active duty. And they passed something called the Quadrennial Review of Military Compensation, and that's still an ongoing process. 1980 is the beginning of the next period, and 1980 was the first time that Congress actually changed the defined benefit formula, even though they didn't call it a reform. They did change the defined benefit formula. In 1985, Congress specified that military retirement would cease to be a pay-as-you-go appropriation and become a funded system. That was an important change. And the third important change in this time period was this law under question itself, the Military Retirement Reform Act of 1986. I should say 1986, not 1979. And so the third time period was 1987 to 1999, and that's the post-MRRA era, which led to the repeal in 1999. I use really about 4 or 5 categories of evidence. The first is budget data from the OMB and from the DoD. The second are newspaper articles from 1965 to 1999 from 3 sources, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Stars and Stripes newspaper. And then the last category of data are congressional hearings from 1965 to 1999. And altogether I get about 2,137 qualitative records. And so the way I code these records are along the lines of these 3 categories that I derive from the literature: the purposes, the criticisms, and the reform aspects. And so my coding really is not a Likert type scale. It's really agree, disagree, or does not mention for those categories. And so this allows me just to categorize both policy image frames and beliefs into agree, disagree, and does not mention. And so what did I find? Really in a nutshell, and I don't have time to go over all these things, but I have a wrap-up slide to this section that shows this. So I find 3 budget conditions that I term as necessary and sufficient signals to Congress that the 1986 reform and the 1999 repeal could happen. I did find that there was punctuated equilibrium in attention shifts. I did find 2 policy image frames, and I did find 2 coalitions, as I highlight on this slide. So let me talk about these really, really quickly. So in terms of budget signals to Congress, if you're sitting in Congress circa 1985, here's what you would have seen. By 1985, we were in the midst of growing deficits, which actually continued to grow. But really, up to about 1970, the budget in terms of surplus versus deficit had remained fairly stable post-World War II. And Congress really had a hard time explaining why deficits continued to grow from 1970 forward. And there were multiple factors. But they knew what a lot of them were, and they speculated on others, and of course they argued about the importance of various factors with each other. But by 1985, Congress had passed the Graham-Rudman legislation to try to shrink deficits. And so deficits were very much on the mind of Congress in the mid-1980s. The second signal really I call in the dissertation a changing of the budgetary social contract. And what I mean by that is that prior to the Great Society programs of the Johnson era, there was always room in the budget to expand for increased military spending, and that it was true of the Civil War, it was true of World War I, it was true of World War II, where Congress and the administration found room in the budget to grow either through deficits or some other means to grow the budgets to account for military spending. Well, really what happened due to Social Security, a New Deal program and the Great Society programs, the spending on human resources depicted in the blue line began to grow, and national defense spending really didn't shrink, but in comparison to human resources spending, it did shrink as a percentage. And so what happens in 1970 is those two lines cross, and effectively they will never meet again. So what that really means as a signal is that flexibility is limited in the budget. And so the third budget signal has to do with this idea of military retirement itself. What Congress failed to grasp, and I talk about this in the dissertation post-World War II, was that military retirement was going to grow in the Cold War era. It's really just a matter of arithmetic. You have more retirees, and then in the 1960s, pay begins to go up. It goes up even more in the early 1970s for military active duty. It goes up again in 1980. And when you have those conditions, basically what's going to happen is military retirement will continue to grow as a function of other DoD spending, such as the DoD total outlay, the military pay outlay, and the civilian pay outlay. And so all these lines here are depicted as a percent of 1972 outlays. 1972 serves as a baseline year in my study because that's the year that Congress really went away from the conscription force to an all-volunteer force and enabled the creation of that by a large pay raise in 1972. And so you can see that as a signal to Congress, military retired pay was problematic. And so all those findings actually, and I don't talk about how I demonstrate punctuated equilibrium, that's in my backup slides. But here's what I want you to see here. The red line at the top is what I call the inverse deficit. So you just take the inverse of the deficit, and you can see that it's increasing up through the 1980s and really into the early 1990s. But this corresponds in 1986 to an increase in media attention, which is the blue line, an increase in testimony, which is the black line, and the military retirement pay, that's the amount that the DoD pays for military retirement itself. All these things punctuate in 1985. The punctuation in the pay in 1985 for military retirement had to do with the establishment of the Military Retirement Fund, but that was by design of Congress to actually lower the cost over time by making it a funded system. But it's also the result of the reform of 1986. And so you can see right after this time period, the interest actually does in fact go down. In the 1990s, say from 1987 through all the way through about 1997, no one was really that interested in talking about military retirement. Suddenly in 1998 and 1999 it peaks, and you can see that the testimonies regarding military retirement spike in 1999, while at the same time the deficit, in this case the inverse deficit, goes away. In 1998 and 1999 we actually see a surplus. And so interestingly enough, the attention paid in Congress to repealing its own 1986 reform spiked at the same time that we have a surplus in the budget. So, what did I find about these policy image frames? Well, here's what I found. Really, there's two policy image frames, one called the high cost frame and one called the effective force management frame. And the way these frames are talked about vary a little bit between the three historical periods. And so remember, a frame is just the way that advocates describe a policy. The high cost frame, when you talk about military retirement, really is that it's too costly and we have to do anything to lower the cost. Something that came up a lot in the second period, 1980 to 1986, was this idea of cost of living allowances. Again, military retirement was actually the vanguard of this. In 1963, cost of CPI-based cost of living allowances adjustments were first applied to military retirement, and then only later on were these kinds of COLAs applied to Social Security and civil service retirement. But by the mid-1980s, Congress and a lot of economists actually started to question, the wisdom of CPI-based cost of living adjustments. And so this comes up a lot for the people using this high cost frame. The other frame is this effective force management frame, and what this really means is that people who advocate this and use this frame are saying that yes, military retirement is expensive, but it actually serves a force management function, which is to say, it's really not there for the retirees. It's actually there to entice active duty people to stay on active duty. And so what people who employ this frame are saying is, look, without this program, we cannot sustain an all-volunteer force. We can't recruit people and we can't retain people. So this slide depicts how these two frames break out. And so here's some examples. You can see on the left, Congressman Les Aspin, who was very much opposed to the military retirement system as it existed and wanted to reform it. Note he depicts military retirement as this thing that applies to officers. So he's talking about an officer, a lieutenant colonel, 46 years old, fairly young, drawing about $15,400 a year, and that's in 1976. So that's somewhere around $65,000 or $70,000 today. On the other side, you see someone from an organization called the Air Force Sergeants Association, which is what I call an MVSO, a Military Veteran Service Organization. Well, how does he frame military retirement? He says, look, can we do any less for our enlisted retirees? Basically, he's telling Congress, for lack of a better term, you are doing poorly by the enlisted members. Here's another one. On the left, this is a Washington Post editorial. So what this editorial really is saying is hey, the best way to keep up with inflation in 1980 as it existed was not work. And so what this author is referring to, this editorialist is referring to, is this idea of cost of living adjustments. So indexing is considered really causal to the deficit. And so indexing in military retirement, in civil service retirement, and in Social Security. On the other hand, the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force in 1983 saying, look, military people aren't stupid, Congress. If they figure out that you're trying to take advantage of them, or if you're trying to make them lose income over their life stream, they're going to get out of the military. And so the fourth finding area had to do with finding coalitions. And as I got into the text, this 2,137 items of text that I had, I found that policy actors I could divide into about 12 different groupings of policy actors as listed on the left-hand column of this slide. And so what I wanted to see is how members of these 12 policy actor categories interacted with each other, and this is what I found. I found that they allied themselves based on the time. So this is an example of what I call the Effective Force Management Alliance. And I use this term alliance as a transitional device to get to coalitions. And I actually found 4 alliances. So note that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 categories of my coded areas where these 4 policy actor groups, administration actors, DoD civilian leaders, DoD uniform leaders, and these MVSOs agree in principle and in belief on these coded areas. And so this is an alliance. And so, but an alliance really isn't a coalition. A coalition is defined really by the ACF as something that's stable over a period of time and something where there's substantial consensus on issues pertaining to the policy core. And I get this from Sabatier and Weibel to define coalitions. And so when I do this, I take my 4 coalitions and I actually come up with only 2 that I think are alliances. So one coalition, or one alliance I should say, really only lasted a short time. This was in 1972 and 1974. And it had to do with something called recomputation, which was a device that was proposed for military retirement and wasn't affected. I get this high cost only alliance, which really is just Congress and presidential administrations when they do happen to agree. But they don't often agree. At various times, either Congress or administrations are saying this is too costly and we need to change it. But there are very few times when they actually agree with each other. And so the last 2, the High Cost Ineffective Force Management Alliance and then the Effective Force Management Alliance, are the 2 that I find to be coalitions because they're both stable, they both have substantial consensus. However, the Effective Force Management Alliance is really the only one that over time appears to be strong. And so here's this high cost ineffective force management alliance. And so what you should notice are in the middle there are 3 groups of actors who are really the core of this alliance. These government research organizations, media actors, and other advocacy groups. And then administration actors are in this and DoD civilian leaders are in this alliance in the first period. And then in the second period, the people who write official studies are in this alliance as well as these think tanks, and they remain in this over time. Well, as it happens, this alliance really was successful in 1986, mostly because this high cost alliance, which I referred to before, 1985 and 1986 was really the only time that Congress and the administration were in agreement that the policy was in fact too costly. And the second coalition that I find is this one called the Effective Force Management, which I deem a strong alliance, even though they were losers in the budget battle in 1986. Not the budget battle, but the policy battle, because they did not want to see the reform happen. However, by 1999, it turns out that this alliance and this coalition was the one coalition that was actually ready to take advantage of a budget surplus and argue for repeal of the 1986 law, and they were in fact successful. And so after I did all this research, I developed this model of a combination of ACF and PET, and this really depicts my policy subsystem over time. And you can see at the bottom, I'm going from pre-1965 up to 1999. So this dashed line is the budget line, and that depicts the incremental growth of military retirement, which punctuates there in 1985 and 1986 with the establishment of the Military Retirement Fund and the repeal, or not the repeal, but the reform of military retirement, which had the effect of bringing down costs, which is what Congress designed. And then when you get that dashed line over to about 1999, that's going to grow again because Congress repealed its own law, which is going to raise costs over time. The other line, the darker dashed line, is attention. And so really what I saw was spikes of attention and an overall increase in attention leading up to about 1985, where media and congressional hearings showed that policymakers really were more interested in military retirement to about 1985 or 1986. And then that dropped precipitously in 1987 and only really returned in about 1999. And so there was two periods of congressional concern. The first one was longer, really, from about the early 1970s through about 1986, where Congress was looking for something, anything really, in this particular area to bring down costs. And by the way, this wasn't the only area, obviously. But then the second period of congressional concern was 1998 and 1999, when Congress suddenly became concerned that retention and recruiting losses could be partially blamed on this Reform Act of 1986, and they repealed it. But during all this period, at the top part of the slide, what you see are these coalitions who are acting. This strong coalition of DoD uniform leaders, military veteran service organizations, and others who are arguing against repeal of reform. They lose the policy battle in 1986, but then they win it in 1999. The weaker coalition, and it's weaker because they don't correspond with each other as much as the members of the other coalition, are these official studies, government research organizations, and they remain loosely coherent over time. And they win in 1986, but that is because the Reagan administration and Congress both happened to apparently agree that the policy was too costly. But they really aren't ready by 1999 to argue against repeal. Well, what are the implications of my study? One thing I found just in general is that I think there are necessary and sufficient conditions for policy reform. In this case, I think we had to see institutional organizational conditions, which happened to be the all-volunteer force in the end of the Cold War. We had to see budgetary conditions, budgets or surpluses, and we had to see socioeconomic conditions, and that was what I referred to as the change in this budget composition post-1965. The second implication is that this idea of policy image frames really become entrenched policy narratives. In other words, people use image frames to argue about policy, but at some point, they're not just image frames that they're using, they're actually part of their belief systems. And that's why, if you notice in the study, the coalitions and the policy image frames really have the same titles, because images become beliefs, and beliefs become images. And I had a difficult time actually separating the two. Why did this reform of 1986 ultimately fail? Well, one reason was it was a cost-only reform. It really didn't address the force structure concerns. And I did find generally that PET and ACF and my synthesis mostly effectively explain this subsystem. So where do I go from here? Well, I've built these coalitions, and so one thing I'm going to be able to do is use other kinds of research to actually go out and find the living, breathing people who are still members of these coalitions, and use some interview and survey research to document these coalitions themselves and to validate them. I can test these policy image frames. For example, what is the impact of reform on recruiting and retention in actual numbers? And then finally, while I was literally writing this dissertation, Congress reformed retirement again in 2015. And I want to look at the Defense Authorization Act for 2016 and its reform to see if I can apply my methodology to that reform. So that ends my presentation here. After this slide, you're going to see a lot of backup slides scroll by, and those are helpful maybe to answer some of your other questions. And this ends the audio part. Thank you very much.